Good evening. You are listening to The Truth Tank, and I am your host, The Tank. If you're a repeat listener, welcome back. And if you've recently discovered The Truth Tank, a big welcome. So on tonight's show, we're going to have a break from the murky and dark world of biological weapons, and we're going to have a look at one of my favourite sports, the NFL, specifically a legendary player of the game. It's been a very big year for the NFL and a very surprising one. We just had the Super Bowl as of last week, and who thought the Bengals would have made the Super Bowl? Do like the Bengals. They have one of the coolest uniforms in the NFL with the tiger stripe helmets and the black and orange tiger stripe jerseys. The new ones, not so much the old ones. But it's good to see a team that wasn't from a massive city finally make it to the Super Bowl. The first time they've been to the Super Bowl in a very long time. And unfortunately, they still haven't won one. We also saw the retirement of two of the modern game's greatest players in Ben Roethlisberger and my favourite, Tom Brady. I mean, what can you say about Tom Brady that hasn't already been said? He is the GOAT. 22 seasons is pretty impressive. I got interested in the NFL the same way a lot of people my age have gotten into the NFL, and that's through the Madden video games. And that was another colossal loss with John Madden passing at the end of last year. You know, he coached, he played, he commentated, he started the video game franchise, which was the introduction to a lot of people of my generation into the NFL. I obviously like the sport, but I get the game, play the career mode, and follow a team right through to the end of the season. In this case, I was going through teams trying to find one that I liked. I liked the colours of the New England Patriots. I was also familiar with a player called Tom Brady, who played on that team, so I thought I might give them a go. Hopefully this gets me into the sport a bit more. I'd always liked the NFL, but I didn't have heaps of access to the NFL back then. This is obviously before streaming and NFL Game Pass, and before it was on TV. That's in Australia, not the US. It's been on TV here for probably about 12 years or so. 10, 12 years, something like that. But before that, the only way to have access to the NFL was through the video games, and a couple of the playoff games in the Super Bowl that they would play on TV once a year. So the Madden games was a really easy way to get access to the NFL year round. You didn't have to wait for the season to start. There probably wasn't a lot of it on YouTube back then. If you didn't have pay TV back then, you probably would never have seen it. Same goes for a lot of the US sports like ice hockey, and baseball and basketball. So I got into the team, I started following it. A few years prior to that, I do remember seeing the New York Giants Patriots Super Bowl where the Patriots got beaten. This was the first time the Giants beat them, and I remember I was working at McDonald's back then. That was in the early 2000s sometime. I remember ducking out the back to the break room where there was a TV and they were playing the Super Bowl. It was old analog TV. There was no digital. They had a really snowy picture. It wasn't very good quality, but you could still make out the teams by what they were wearing. I remember Brady and the Patriots trying to come back and just falling short and ultimately losing the Super Bowl, and just seeing him on the field with this devastated look on his face. I thought, I like that guy. He just kept fighting and kept playing to the end. He didn't give up. He didn't panic. He just kept going. So fast forward a couple of years, I went and got the game and followed the Patriots through the career mode. So in 2007, I got my first NFL jersey, which was the on-field Reebok Tom Brady jersey. It was like the same quality as the one the players wear on the field. It cost a fucking fortune. It was, I know, like $250+. Brought it off of eBay back in the day when they used to ship here, and I still have it. Still in pretty good condition. But that's a bit of pointless information. So, I've said my piece. I just wanted to say a little tribute to the great Tom Brady, the GOAT of the NFL. I haven't seen a season of the NFL where Tom Brady hasn't played, so that definitely says a lot. He's been playing as long as I've been watching. It's going to be really weird to go into the next season and not have Tom Brady playing. Thank you for 22 fantastic years of watching the NFL, and happy retirement. So anyway, on tonight's show, we are going to be having a look at the oldest player to have ever played in the NFL, and no, it's not Tom Brady. It is none other than the great George Blanda, who played in 26 seasons and retired at the grand old age of 48 years old. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's show. This is episode 34 of the Truth Tank. George Blanda, the old man of the NFL. So before Brady, Rodgers, Roethlisberger, Breeze, Wilson, Stabler, Starbuck, Bradshaw, Montana, Marino, and Favre, there was George Blanda. His playing career began in 1949, predating a majority of NFL legends mentioned above. Blanda and Brady have a lot in common. Both have had incredibly long and successful careers. Both have set records in pretty much every category there is for a quarterback to set records in. Both are part of the Over 40 club, and now that Brady has retired at the age of 44, that leaves George Blanda as the oldest ever NFL player, retiring at the ripe old age of 48. As it stands today, there has been 62 over 40-year-old players to have played in the NFL. Out of those 62 players, there's only ever been 2 players to have played over the age of 45 years old. One of those players is Morton Anderson, 47. He was a kicker who retired in 2007. He played for the Atlanta Falcons. And of course there's George Blanda, who retired at 48 in 1975. He played for several clubs over his career, but he retired playing for the Raiders as a kicker and a backup quarterback every once in a while. The oldest players playing at the moment, now that Brady has retired, Rams tackle Andrew Whitworth, who is 40. And after winning the Super Bowl last week, it's a safe bet that he's probably going to retire come next season. You also have the Chicago Bears offensive tackle Jason Peters, who is 40, followed closely behind by Browns punter Dustin Colquitt, who is 39. I'm not sure I'm saying his name properly. So now that Brady's gone and Roethlisberger's gone, that leaves one man as the oldest quarterback in the league, and that is none other than the legend in his own right, Ryan Fitzpatrick, aka Fitzmagic. He is 39 years old, and that makes him the oldest quarterback left in the league, followed closely by Aaron Rodgers at 38. Then there is one of the greatest place kickers in the history of the NFL, Adam Vinatieri. He played 24 seasons with Patriots and then for the Colts. In 2019, he suffered a season-ending knee injury in December of that year and retired on the 26th of May, 2021, making him technically the oldest active NFL player, but he didn't play in the 2020 season. I think he turned 49 on December 28th, where Blanda retired closer to 49 than to 48. The only difference is Blanda played in his final season. George Frederick Blanda was born on the 17th of September 1927 to Michael and Mary Blanda in Youngswood, Pennsylvania. George was one of 7 boys. You can imagine what growing up in a Blanda household would have been like. So maybe this is where the young George gets his toughness from, growing up with 6 other brothers who were probably all fighting and beating the living shit out of each other every second day. The Slovak-born Michael Blanda was a coal miner working in and around the Pittsburgh area. He supported his large family as best he could, but things weren't always easy. And working as a coal miner wasn't always the most stable way to earn a living. This was especially true given the nature of the coal industry. Mines in the area were known to close, leaving the Blanda family in the poorhouse, literally. George and his brothers knew all too well the sting of poverty, and if I was to guess, I would say this is where George gets a lot of his toughness from. He grew up without a lot, with a lot of brothers. There would have been a lot of fights over scraps of food, handed down clothes. There probably wouldn't have been a hell of a lot of room in the house. He also would have learnt to share pretty early on, and he also would have learned how to handle himself. He also wasn't like a lot of modern day players, obsessed with the money and the glamour that comes with being a professional footballer. He seems to me to be a very down-to-earth, very rough and rugged individual. He also would have been used to the uphill struggle that can come with growing up in a poor family. But he also would have learned valuable lessons, such as persevering through adversity. So despite the struggles George faced, he found an outlet in sport. And as it turned out, he was genetically designed for football and athletic pursuits. He found his love of the game when he went to Youngwood High School, where he played football, obviously, but he also played basketball and was pretty proficient at track and field. What sets George apart from a lot of other Hall of Famers is that he played several positions in various capacities over his course of his career. George was tall, he had an athletic, muscular build, which made him perfectly suited for differing positions on the field. He also had a natural talent for the positions of quarterback, kicker, and in later years he even tried his hand at defense as a linebacker. Some say he played linebacker once in a while, others say it was more scattered out. It was maybe once a season or it was a very, very rare occurrence that he would play linebacker. And some history also suggests he might have played blocker, which I couldn't find a hell of a lot to back that up. But who knows? He could have played both. He probably did. If he played linebacker, he probably filled in for a blocker every once in a while. Someone could have got injured. And obviously a lot of these games weren't televised and recorded as a piece of sporting history like they are today. They didn't have 50 different high-definition cameras filming from every different angle, sideline cameramen, spider cameras, and thousands of fans in the stands filming stuff on their phones. During his days at Youngswood, George spends much of his time honing his skills on the football field. Despite his natural talents, George wasn't a football prodigy. He was pretty good, but by no means was he handed his skills on a silver platter. He wasn't like some of the younger quarterbacks you see today who are selected for the NFL straight out of college. They have these ridiculous collegiate careers where they're the top dog in their division. They win all the awards, get all the points, get all the glitz and glamour, get all the girls, and then get this huge contract handed to them by the NFL and go on to have a pretty successful, nearly flawless career playing professionally. George had it a little tougher. So as I mentioned, George was good, but he did have to work at his skills. I'm sure all these guys have to work on their skills, but some players do have an easier ride than others. So the time spent on the gridiron, along with his skills, didn't go unnoticed. George was a pretty decent player, and this was recognised when he was offered a scholarship by the University of Kentucky to play as kicker and quarterback. The young George Blanda attends the University of Kentucky between 1945 to 1948. And this is where his football career really starts to take off. Over the course of his career, George had some pretty incredible coaches, some very legendary figures, and this starts right from college. So George's first season didn't go to plan. The Wildcats / Blanda's first team had a pretty abysmal season, winning 1 out of 10 games they played that season. So in 1946, during his sophomore year, the legendary coach Paul Bear Bryant was hired as head coach to turn the Wildcats' fortunes around. So Bear Bryant, much like George Blanda, had become a legend, setting and breaking records for coaching. He was, one of Alabama Crimson Tide's most successful coaches in the history of the team. He's coached for numerous different college teams over the years, but he found great success with Alabama. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure the Alabama Crimson Tide Stadium is named after him. I might be wrong on that. Bear Bryant's coaching career started in 1936 after graduating from the University of Alabama. He took an assistant coaching position under A.B. Hollingsworth at the Union Uni in Jackson. This didn't last very long. He left not too long afterwards to take up an assistant coaching position at the University of Alabama under Frank Thomas. He stayed there for 4 years, leaving in 1940 with an impressive 29-5-3 record. So next up, he takes another assistant coaching position under Henry Russell Sanders at Vanderbilt University. He takes over as head coach of the Commodores after Sanders is out of action after having his appendix removed. They finish the season tied with Kentucky at 7 games apiece. The following year, in 1941, he is offered the head coaching position at the University of Arkansas. This is around the same time that Pearl Harbor is attacked. So not long after this, Bear Bryant joins the Navy. He also coaches while in the Navy, coaching the Navy side for several years after that. So we fast forward a little bit, and it's now 1945, and the 32-year-old Bear Bryant meets Washington Redskins owner George Marshall during a party. That's the politically incorrect Washington name. They've finally been renamed to the Commanders, and it took 4 years to come up with that. Probably could have come up with a better name, like, I don't know, the Wildcats or something like that, the fucking Washington Cougars. Anything would have been better than that. So Bear Bryant tells George that he has passed on a few assistant coaching positions because he had his mind set on a head coaching spot instead. So Marshall puts him in touch with the president and a fellow coach, a man with the very iconic name, Harry Clifton Curly Bird. I wonder how he got that name. Harry Clifton Curly Bird. Yeah, okay. Clifton Bird. So, Bear and Curly meet the next day, and Bear got the job as the new head coach of the Maryland Terrapins. But this, like a majority of his jobs, didn't last. Bear was only there for the one season. His record was pretty decent, 6 wins, 2 losses and a draw. However, Bear and Curly didn't get along very well. So Coach Bear leaves at the end of the 1945 season. He takes the head coaching job in 1946 at the University of Kentucky Wildcats, and this is where he and Blanda cross paths. While he was at Kentucky, Bear turns the Wildcats around, taking them to their very first bowl in 1947. They win the conference title in 1950 with 11 wins and 1 loss. In later years, he leads the Wildcats to the Great Lakes Bowl, Cotton Bowl, and the Orange Bowl. So coming back to Blanda, the pair meet in Blanda's second year. Coach Bryant made an impression on the young George. This is a quote from Blanda. "I thought this was what God must look like." So talk about a first impression. It's a pretty big compliment to be called "this is what God must look like" by one of the NFL's greatest players. And I'm sure that George wouldn't have been the only person that thought Coach Bear Bryant was a larger-than-life figure. He had a reputation that preceded him, and obviously as time has gone by, he has become a legendary larger-than-life figure himself. George's instincts proved to be right. Bear Bryant completely turned the Wildcats' luck around and transformed him into a powerhouse-winning team that would dominate over the next few years under Bear's coaching. By the end of the 1945 season, the Wildcats finished with a 9-1 record. And this was a pattern that continued for the next 3 years, with the Wildcats only losing a game a season, making their loss record from 1945, 1946 and 47 3 whole games. That's not too bad by any standard. A game a year is pretty good, 3 games in total. Granted, the season's only 10 games long, but that's still a very decent record. I'm sure the losses weren't by huge margins. So in the last 2 years of Blanda's college years, 1947 and 1948, he worked his way up under Coach Bear to starting quarterback. And once again, his numbers and his records were pretty decent. They weren't record-breaking by any means, but they were decent enough. Over the course of the 1947-48 season, George had 120 completions, 242 passes for 1,451 yards. He also had 12 touchdowns, totaling a 49.6% completion rate, leading the Wildcats' offense. So these are not too bad numbers. They're very decent for back then. By today's standards, they could be considered decent or average or maybe even low, but it's still a very decent record to come out of college with. So George knew his numbers were decent, but figured they probably were too low to make him an attractive NFL prospect. George finishes university and parts ways with Bear Bryant. It's now 1949, and despite what George thought of his college record, the football gods were shining down on him. the Chicago Bears, and yet another legendary coach and football icon, George Halas, aka Mr. Everything, aka Papa Bear, took an interest in Blanda. During the 1949 NFL draft, Blanda was the 119th draft pick and was selected by the Bears in the 12th round. Halas was a player, coach, and owner. He was a native of Chicago. He also was the owner and founder of the Chicago Bears, acting as head coach at differing times over the decades. Halas also played outfielder for the New York Yankees in 1919 after getting back from World War I, where he was in the Navy. He's another interesting character who's had a very long and very interesting and diverse career that warrants its own podcast. The stuff that this guy did in his life is pretty amazing. Fought in several wars, played in several different sports. So if that wasn't enough, he was also the co-founder of the American Professional Football Association in 1920, which is now known today as the NFL. He's a very forward-thinking, entrepreneurial guy. He had a lot of different interests and a lot of fingers in a lot of pies. He could obviously see what the league could become and acted on it. He held the oldest coach record, being 72 years, 318 days old when he coached his last NFL game. That is until Romeo Crennel, at 73 years old, 115 days. His coaching spans multiple decades, starting in 1920 and finishing in 1967. He was also one of the first inductees into the first Pro Football Hall of Fame. Halas had an interest in Blanda and signed him to the Bears on a multi-year contract in 1949. George was signed for an eye-watering $6,000 with a $600 signing bonus that Halas wanted paid back when Blanda got a spot on the team. It's the one fault of George Halas' character is he was a tight ass. This comes from him being an entrepreneur and businessman, having many interests across the business world. But unfortunately, this is a huge reason that Blanda and Halas butt heads in the years to come, is him being a tight ass and not wanting to pay players a higher wage. So once again, the road was not easy for Blanda. From 1949 to 52, he hardly plays, and he finds it pretty tough to secure a position on the roster. He was hired as a quarterback and a kicker, much the same as he had been in college, but like college, he had to work hard to get a spot in the field. And to make matters worse, his stats in his rookie year weren't very impressive. He only throws for a dismal 197 yards, combined with 5 interceptions and no touchdowns. His kicking stats weren't much better. He only kicks 15 field goals, hitting 7 of them. He also punted, which was probably his best stats by far. That year, he had 19 punts with 746 yards, giving him a 39.3 yard average. So, you can't hold this against him. This is his first year as a professional footballer, and most young quarterbacks and players don't have a very good year. Some do, some completely fizzle out. As in the case of Joe Burrow versus Trevor Lawrence. Joe Burrow had a great year, minus the season-ending ACL he had. Next year, he goes to the Super Bowl. He revives the Cincinnati Bengals, and obviously the way they've traded, they've also had a lot to do with it, not just him. Trevor Lawrence, on the other hand, has an awesome college career. His first year in the NFL absolutely sucks. He doesn't manage to do much. The team has one of the worst finishes in the NFL. There's a lot of issues with the coach. And he doesn't put up a lot of memorable stats that year. He had a pretty average season. Not saying that he won't pick that up this year. But it was a fucking train wreck from start to finish. But a lot of Halas' concern seems to go unwarranted. The Bears finished the season in a pretty decent spot with a 9-3 record. It is now 1950, and George Blanda didn't see much action at all. He was mainly a bench warmer. Although Halas did try something out of the box and used George as a linebacker from time to time. So who knows, he could have been a star linebacker if he had more playing time that year. It seems to me that Blanda does get a bit of a raw deal from Halas. Halas doesn't really seem to trust him on the field. He doesn't get much chance to prove it either. He doesn't get much time on the field, and I'm making an assumption here that Halas seems impatient. players take time to develop. Not everyone hits the ground running and has an outstanding first season or first couple of seasons. Some players need that build-up time. They need time on the field to develop their skills and to get comfortable in a spot. Some don't. Maybe Blanda needs a few more games under his belt before he finds his feet and becomes comfortable in the role of quarterback or kicker. 1951 was much the same for George as 1950 had been. He didn't play quarterback for those 2 years. His linebacker stats were 1 pick for the 51 season. He did play kicker somewhat, kicking 17 field goals during the 1951 season, completing only 6 of them though. It's a new season and a new year. The 52 season saw Blanda take the field in the quarterback spot, but only for a limited time. Once again, he puts up some average stats, throwing for 664 yards, 11 interceptions, and 8 touchdowns. He returns to the kicker role as well. Unfortunately, it was on par with his previous season. Blanda kicked 25 field goals, making only 6 of them. The Bears finished 1952 season on a pretty average note. It's not great, and it's nothing to jump up and down about. They finished with a 5-7 record. This brings us to the 1953 season, and George wants a shot at the starting quarterback position. He is done with playing second fiddle, and he wanted a shot as a starter. He was getting sick of not taking the field, and the piss poor amount of time he had been getting over the past couple of seasons. He was also getting sick of Hallis and his penny-pinching attitude. The biggest cause of conflict between these two was the lack of game time George was getting and his flatlining pay. Blanda hadn't received a pay rise in 4 years. He had been at the club. If you look at this in terms of modern day standards and how today's players will have a cry if they don't get some ridiculous contract that is guaranteed for X amount of years, like pro sport is a business like any other. It's designed to make money. It's not about the sport so much as it is about the dollars. And when you consider that with modern day contracts and the ludicrous amount of money some players get, as in like they get $500 million for a 10-year contract, $200 million for 4 or 5 years. When you consider the modern day amount, what Blanda was asking was pretty reasonable. He was asking for a few $1,000s. With today's conversion, it's obviously more than the $6,000 he was asking back then, but it was still pretty reasonable. It was a reasonable amount to ask for a professional athlete back then, and it is nothing compared to what some players get for a single season or even a signing bonus today. In hindsight, it doesn't seem that over the top for Blanda to ask for a pay rise of a few $1,000s. So this leads Blanda to look elsewhere for a starting position. He reaches out to the Hamilton Tiger Cats in the Canadian Football League, and a deal was nearly done when Hallis finally caved and gave George the pay rise he wanted. Hallis gave him a small pay rise, bringing his pay to a grand total of $11,600. By the time the start of the 53 season rolled around, Blanda's prospects were looking up. He finally got his chance to play starting quarterback for the 1953 season. The time he had put in so far over the past few seasons, combined with his decent stats, made him a pretty safe and reliable choice to kick off the 53 season. This is a quote from George Blanda about Hallis. "He was too cheap to even buy me a kicking shoe." End quote. George earned his pay during the season, throwing 15 touchdowns, 362 attempts at passing, completing 169 of them, leading the league, all in just 8 games, giving Blanda a quarterback rating of about 52.3%. So it's not too bad. It's a pretty big improvement over the previous seasons. He thought he deserved the pay rise, and he earned the pay rise, and he had proved that he was worth the money. All he needed was a bit more time on the field to prove that he could really play. And by the end of the season, he's a league leader, and after all, a league leader should get a pay rise and recognition. Unfortunately for Blanda and the Bears, that was about the only highlight of the season. It ended with a pretty average record of 3 wins, 8 losses, and 1 tie, with 7 of the closest games being decided by a single touchdown or a field goal. So 53 is in the review, and it's on to the 54 season. Blanda had proved he could handle the responsibilities of a starting quarterback. Blanda and the Bears enter the 54 season with high hopes. George picks up where he left off as a starting quarterback. The 54 season starts off the same as any other until that fateful day in Week 8. It was the Chicago Bears versus the Cleveland Browns. And it was during the game that George gets injured, suffering a separated shoulder, which sidelined him for the remaining 4 games of the season. The backup quarterback, Zeke Barkowski, took over the remaining 4 games of the season. The Bears finished the season with an 8-4 record, just missing the playoffs once again. Blanda's stats were okay, with the 4 losses happening in games where he had started. He throws 15 touchdowns and 15 interceptions. So his interception and touchdown rate are pretty much the same. You obviously want more TDs than you do interceptions. It's not a great stat to have on the records, but at the same time, it's unavoidable. The 54 season ends on a sour note for Blanda, which carries over to the next 4 seasons. The 1955, 56, 57 and 58 seasons, Blanda was used as a backup quarterback and a kicker. He lost the top spot to Ed Brown. So his stats over these 4 seasons are pretty much non-existent, except for the kicking. The 56 season saw a few changes. Hallis left or was fired after the Bears lost to the New York Giants during the NFL championship game of that year. But George was still stuck on understudy duties, playing less time than he had, in some cases hardly taking the field at all. Not a lot changed over the next few years. During the 1958 season, Blanda didn't see much field time at all, which really cements his decision. George has had enough of the Bears, the coaching staff and the management, and he decides to retire at the end of the season. So at this point, Blanda has played for the Bears for 10 years, which is a longer career than most people get in the NFL. What they say about the NFL, it stands for not for long. So he's already played double the length of time a average player then or now gets to play in the NFL. So he's had a pretty rocky, pretty average start to the NFL. He decides to retire. No one would fault him for that. Also at this point, he's played in high school, college, and professionally. He's got nothing left to prove, and he can retire a happy man, knowing he's played in high school, college, and professionally. So Blanda spent 10 years with the Bears. In his final 4 years, his record speaks for itself, even if he was a backup. Which really does make you wonder, what if he had started all those 4 years? Would the Bears have made it to the playoffs? Would they have gone to a championship? Would they have a better winning record if he was the starting quarterback? If he had the opportunity to start for all those years? So over his career with the Bears, he throws for 982 yards, gets 11 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, and completes 48 out of 93 field goals. I'm going to read a quote by George Blanda that sums up his feelings towards his time at the Bears. "I didn't have much fun playing on the same team with Sid Luckman and Bulldog Turner and against people like Sammy Barr. Those were nostalgic days for me. Hallis was a great coach, but the only problem I had with him, the problem all the players had with him, was that we didn't get paid very much." So it's now 1959, and George is relaxing, enjoying the retired life, going about his business. He spends about a year away from the game he loves so much. That is until the formation of the AFL. It is now the swinging 60s, and a new decade brought with it new opportunities, and one of these opportunities was about to come Blanda's way. The newly formed Houston Oilers sought out George. They wanted him to be their quarterback and kicker for the inaugural AFL season. So what is George to do? He obviously accepts the position the Oilers offer him and restarts his career. So Blanda is obviously not done with football, and as it turns out, he did have more to prove. Or was this simply because he loved the game and he didn't get much of a chance during his 10 years with the Bears to prove himself, or just to play? You can look at that in 2 different ways, but I think it comes down to him just loving the game. I don't think he's a guy that really has to prove anything to anybody. I think he's more secure with himself than that. At this stage in his career, George is roughly in his early 30s, so he's still young enough to play at a competitive and a professional level. He would have been a hell of a lot older than most of the people in the league, or coming into the league, and his age definitely makes him a senior player. And in a way, destiny does intervene in the formation of the AFL. Blanda's stats were also pretty good too. They weren't blow your face off out of this world records by any means, but they were attractive enough to get a starting position with a new team in a new league. And obviously the AFL took a lot of risks with the formation of a new league, taking on the NFL. You're going up against the established, tried and tested football league, and this is the new kid on the block trying to make a name for itself. So in a way, they both kind of need each other. Blanda doesn't really fit with the way the NFL was played back then. He doesn't get a lot of chances to prove himself. It's more of a defensive-driven game, and the AFL seems to fit with Blanda's style of playing a lot better. And the AFL is obviously taking chances, trying to get players to come over to its league, and a recently retired quarterback and kicker like George Blanda would have been a very easy choice to make. It also gave George a new lease of life for the game and a new inspiration to play. The NFL, as most of you would probably know, was more defensive and strategy orientated back then. The motto was defense wins games, whereas the AFL was more about offense and passing the ball as much as possible, which also made it a faster paced and higher scoring game. There's more to it than that, but that's a quick rundown. Look it up yourself. It's a pretty interesting history, the NFL versus the AFL, and how both leagues formed and how the AFL kind of broke away and eventually got absolved by the NFL during the 70s, I think it was. Well, either way, we'll come back to that later in the story. So the AFL back then was more like the modern day NFL, where it has become all about the offense, and a lot of the offensive rule changes that have happened over the last couple of years have helped to turn the NFL into more of an offense-based game than the defensive-based game that it used to be. It's 1960, the season kicks off, and Blanda takes the AFL's faster and passing-focused format like a duck to water. It suited his style of play more, and he found it to be much more enjoyable than playing under Hallis on the Bears. It's a new season, new league, it's a new team and a new coach. Lou Reimkus oversaw head coaching duties for the 1960 season, before being fired early on in the 1961 season due to a 1 win, 3 losses, 1 tie record. Not a great way to start a new season in a new league. So Reimkus didn't have a very good year, but Blanda on the other hand did, and it showed in his first season stats. Blanda threw for 2,413 yards, threw 24 touchdowns and 22 interceptions. It also marked the first time that he had thrown more touchdowns than interceptions in a season, giving him a QB rating of 45.5%. He also kicked 32 field goals, 15 of them going through the uprights, ending the first year with a 10-4 record, which is a step up from the previous seasons. The 4 games in which the Oilers lose all come down to a point or a few points. Week 1, the Oilers beat the Raiders in the season opener, losing to them in Week 3 in a very close 13-14 game. They lose again to the Buffalo Bills in Week 8, 25-24. They then lose to the LA Chargers in Week 10, 24-21, losing their last game of the season in Week 13 to the Dallas Texans in a pretty shock blowout of 24-0. Due to their 10-4 record, the Oilers made the first ever AFL Championship game, defeating the Chargers in a 24-16 victory. This capped off a pretty good inaugural season, not just for Blanda and the Oilers, but for the AFL as well. It was fastly proving that it was a very entertaining league to watch and might be a threat to the NFL down the track. It's now 1961, and Blanda started as quarterback again in what would become a standout year for George and for the Oilers. The season gets off to a pretty slow start. The Oilers win their first game against the Raiders in a shock blowout of 55-0. The next 4 games aren't as easy going. They lose the next 3 straight games in a row to the Chargers, the Texans and the Bills, before drawing with the Boston Patriots in a 31-31 game in Week 6. Week 2 was a bye, so maybe that had something to do with the 3-game losing streak. They win and they have that week off right after a huge win. They go into the 3rd game rested with a false sense of confidence and they get beaten. Maybe, maybe not. After the rocky start, Reimkes was shown the door and replaced with Wally Lem. Under Lem, the Oilers win the next 9 games, rounding out the season. It was pretty small in comparison with today's NFL. There was only 7 teams in the AFL at that time, and everyone played the same team over and over and over again throughout the season. You got very used to playing certain teams and you could probably figure out their pattern pretty quickly. Would have been like the XFL, where there's only a handful of teams and they play each other every 3 to 4 weeks. One of the season's highlights came in Week 11 when the Oilers played the New York Titans, who later changed their name to the Jets. I'm pretty sure they changed their name in the second year of the league. I'm not sure why they chose Jets over Titans. Titans sounds better. But anyway, it's history. So Blanda threw 7 touchdowns in that one game, making him one of 4 players in history to do so. The final score was the Oilers 49, Titans 13. They played the Titans again in Week 14, beating them 48-21. The Oilers made it to another championship game, playing once again the LA Chargers, beating them 10-3. Blanda scored all the points in that game. Given he was the quarterback and the kicker, he does have a bit of an advantage. It must have been very tiring playing 2 positions. Like modern players don't play 2 positions, or very rarely do they play 2 positions that frequently throughout a game, if they played at all. So he would have been out there every time the offense scored. It would have been really tiring. You would have to score a touchdown, then go kick the field goal. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a huge job, but it's just another physical and mental stress of the game. You scored the touchdown, now you've got to worry about converting the point after. But this doesn't really seem to bother Blanda. He seems to like playing both positions. He doesn't really seem to be bothered by it too much. So by the end of the 1961 season, Blanda had thrown for a very impressive 3,330 yards. He threw 36 touchdowns and 22 interceptions, making this a pretty big improvement over the past seasons, ending the year with a combined rating of 91.3%. His quarterback rating was 61.5%, making it the highest so far. So the stats speak for themselves. The last year's stats was 45.5%, so that is a pretty big step up. To top it all off, he also led the AFL in yards. His touchdown record of 7 touchdowns in one game lasted for a pretty impressive 23 years before being broken by the great Dan Marino. He was also awarded the AFL's Player of the Year, MVP, and was also on the first All-AFL team, as well as an AFL All-Star. It was also the same year that Mike Ditka was a first-round draft pick. He could have retired after that year on those stats alone, and that would have been enough to make him one of the all-time leaders in a single season. So it's 1962, and Blanda followed up the success of the previous season. And just like the previous seasons, a new year meant a new coach. This year, head coaching duties fell to Pop Ivy. The 1962 season was pretty much the highly anticipated sequel to the 61 season. Blanda had more to show and found his groove in the AFL's fast-paced game, setting more and more records as the seasons went on. There were 2 games during the season where Blanda threw for 400 passing yards in each game. He also threw 27 touchdowns and threw for 2,810 yards, kicking 11 field goals, so that's not too bad. It's not quite as impressive as the 1961 season, but definitely a very big improvement over the 1960 season. He also set a new record of 42 interceptions, which was the league record for interceptions. George seems to break a lot of records whenever he played, so why not break the interception record, as well as the most touchdowns scored in a game. If you're going to break a record, you might as well break one that no one else wants to. So the Oilers win the opening Caesar against the Bills in a 28-23 win. They lose the second game to the Patriots, 21-34. The Oilers win the next 3 in a row before a loss to the Denver Broncos and the Dallas Texans in weeks 7 and 8. Blanda and the Oilers win every remaining game of the season from weeks 9 onwards. They also have a back-to-back game against the Texans in weeks 8 and 9. They lost one game to them, winning the week after. The Oilers once again returned to their 3rd AFL Championship game, which was the 3rd ever AFL Championship game. They faced off against their state rivals, the Dallas Texans. The game was epic, to say the least. Blanda threw 2 touchdowns that game and followed it up with 2 extra points. He also scored a memorable 31-yard field goal, but it just wasn't enough. The Oilers and Texans went to double overtime. As much of a fight as Blanda and the Oilers put up, they eventually lose the game by a measly 3 points, ending in a 2017 final score. By the end of the 1962 season, the Oilers finished with a very respectable 11-3 record. So this sets a new benchmark for the team, and George Blanda makes the AFL All-Star team for the second straight year. It's now the 1963 season, and the big question surrounding Blanda and the Oilers was, can they repeat the success of the previous 2 seasons? Returning for coaching duties again was Pop Ivy. Over the course of the season, Blanda threw for 3,003 passing yards, going back-to-back, leading the league for the second year in a row. He threw 24 touchdowns and cuts down on the amount of interceptions, throwing only 25. It's not bad, it's not a huge reduction in interceptions, but it's better than an increase in interceptions. But it was not meant to be. Despite Blanda's best efforts to lead the Oilers to another championship game, the team falls well short of the success gained in the 1960, 1961 and 1962 seasons. Blanda made the AFL selection again and earned himself another AFL All-Star spot for the numbers he had put up during the season. By the end of 1963, the Oilers failed to make the playoffs. They ended the season with 6 wins and 8 losses. The first half of the season started off well enough. The Oilers lose the opening game to the Raiders. They win in Week 2 against the Broncos, lose to the New York Jets and beat the Bills, losing to the Chiefs in the week after. They hit a 3-game winning streak between Week 6 and 8, beating the Broncos, Bills and Chiefs, but then they lose the week after to the Boston Patriots and beat the Jets just before the bye week. The final 4 games of the season, the Oilers lose every game. To make the final 4 games even more frustrating, the Oilers go down to the Raiders in the final game, 49-52. To make the final 4 games even more frustrating, the Oilers go down to the Raiders in the final game of the season, 52-49. If they had beaten the Raiders, that probably would have been enough to take them to the playoffs, but it was not meant to be. Blanda played well even if the Oilers didn't, and unfortunately the success train had pretty much derailed by this point, and this pattern of losing would repeat itself over the next few seasons. The 1964 season wasn't much better for the Oilers. Sammy Barr takes over as head coach duties from Pop Ivy. Blanda, on the other hand, stat-wise, had a pretty decent year, throwing for 3,287 passing yards. It's nearly on par with the 1961 season, where he threw 3,330. He also throws 17 touchdowns and 27 interceptions, which gives him a quarterback rating of about 51.9%. I think, don't quote me on those numbers. I might have got a couple of them mixed up because there's a lot of stats to go through. He also had 29 field goal attempts, completing about 13 of them, giving him a 44.8% kicker rating. That was about the only highlight of what was a utterly abysmal season. The season starts off on the wrong foot with a loss to the San Diego Chargers. Weeks 2 and 3 give a little ray of light. The Oilers win both games, beating the Raiders and the Broncos. Then things go very sideways as of Week 4. The Oilers go on a 9-game losing streak. Some games are blowouts and others are painfully close losses, like the 25-24 loss to the Patriots in Week 9. Week 13 is the bye week. The Oilers win the final 2 games of the season, beating the Jets and the Broncos, ending the season on a pretty depressing 4 wins, 10 losses, putting the icing on a very shitty year. So it's now 1965 and things don't get any better. Sammy Barr is gone and replaced with Hugh Taylor as head coach. Blanda has a pretty good year, as he always does, setting records and leading the league in passing yards. He throws 2,542 passing yards, throwing 20 touchdowns and 30 interceptions, with a QB rating of about 47.9%. So not too bad overall, not a drastic decline in numbers. The failures of the Oilers are not all Blanda's fault either. The Oilers as a whole were not what they had been. Player changes and coaching changes had pretty much derailed what the Oilers had once been. So who really knows what other issues or what the main issues were behind the decline of the Oilers? So Blanda, as always, resumes kicking duties during the 65 season. He attempts 21 field goals, making 10 of them, ending the season on a pretty respectable 52.4% field goal rating. The 65 season starts off well, with the Oilers winning their first 2 games against the Jets and the Boston Patriots. From weeks 3 to 6, the Oilers lose 3 games in a row, with a bye in week 5. What I've noticed about the Oilers is they always seem to lose after the bye week. Is this because they're too rested? Or they have a rest, go into the week thinking they're going to win with that false sense of security that because they're more rested than the opposition, they have a better chance of winning. Maybe it's also to do with the travel, but if they have the away game that week, who really knows, but they always seem to lose in the week following the bye. It would have been very hard to try and get used to one playing or coaching style when you have the coaches change every year. I mean, the success of those teams that become dynasties like the Patriots or the Chiefs, they become successful over a period of time, working with the same head coach, at least with the same core playing group. It can take time figuring out how a certain coach likes to play or coach and how he does things. This might not always gel with the head management or the owner. To have to constantly adapt to new coaching and playing styles each year would be really annoying. It also could explain why the Oilers had such up and down years. It always seems to happen in years where there's coaching changes. So weeks 7 and 8, the Oilers get 2 wins over the Chiefs and the Bills before going on a 7-game losing streak. There's not many close losses, most are by 9 points or more, with the end of season 42-14 thrashing by the Patriots. They end the 65 season with the same standings as the 64 season, with a 4 wins, 10 losses. It's now 1966, and the 1966 season isn't much of an improvement and pans out pretty much the same way as the previous 3 seasons have. Taylor is shown the door as coach, and they welcome back Wally Lem as head coach from the 61 season. The 39-year-old Blanda's season is up and down. His stats are good, but they do decline sharply on the quarterback front. Blanda throws for 1,764 yards. He throws 17 touchdowns and 21 interceptions. This is the first time he threw more interceptions than touchdowns in the recent years. So he has an overall quarterback rating of about 45%. He also kicks again, attempting 30 field goals and getting 16 of them, with a kicking rating of about 53.3%. So all in all, it's not too bad. It is a decline over previous seasons. It does seem low, even though the passing yards he does get in that year are probably better than a lot of quarterbacks, and they are pretty decent. But it does seem low due to the other seasons being so unusually high. So the Oilers win the first 2 games of the season against the Broncos and Raiders. They win 45-7 and 31-0. They lose in week 3 and 4 and 5 to the Jets, Bills and Broncos before a win in week 7. The win in week 7 sparks a little hope that the season might not be a complete write-off. The Oilers beat the Jets 24-0. But in week 8, a new threat in the AFL rises and upsets the Oilers' plans at a championship run. The expansion franchise, known as the Miami Dolphins, comes into the league, upsetting the order of the past 6 years. The new team presents a new challenge. The Dolphins have a pretty shitty year, finishing with a 3-win and 11-loss record. 2 of their 3 wins are against the Oilers. In week 7 and 8, the Dolphins beat the Broncos 24-7 and beat the Oilers in week 8, winning 20-13. The Dolphins beat the Oilers again in week 16 in a season-ending upset, winning 29-28. It's a very shitty way to end an already pretty shitty year. From week 8, the Oilers go on a 8-game losing streak, ending the season with 3 wins and 11 losses. So the 1967 season brought with it some changes. The nightmare of the past 4 seasons was in the rear view. The Oilers needed to make a few changes, and tough decisions needed to be made in order to rebuild the team. Even during the tougher years with the Oilers, Blanda constantly put up impressive numbers and stats and was one of the AFL's top 10 players. He was also the league leader in completions and passing attempts in 1963, 64 and 65. That is more than can be said for the team as a whole. So unfortunately, the obvious and easiest changes to make were to quarterback. In March 18 of 1967, the Oilers released Blanda from his contract. Blanda, being the professional that he was, left Houston with no hard feelings. He comments on his feelings about leaving the Oilers a few years later, and this is a quote: "The Oilers were a great group of guys and a great team with a lot of speed. It was exciting to start something new, and I was proud of playing in the AFL. I felt, even in the early years, that we had some teams that were as good as a lot of teams in the other league," meaning the NFL. "We had to do some things to get the fans and the television people interested, so I threw the ball 68 times in one game, 58 in another, 55 and 50. It was a fun period of time." So it's now 1967, and George is turning 40, and retirement is looking pretty good. Blanda doesn't have anything more to prove on a football field. He's played in 2 leagues, led the AFL in passing yards, completions, etc. He also joins a small list of quarterbacks to lead the league in completions for 3 straight years, the other being Dan Marino. These 2 are the only pros to lead their league in completions for 3 consecutive seasons. During the 1961 season, his record of 36 touchdowns was the most that had ever been thrown in the AFL, or the NFL for that matter, over the course of a single season by a quarterback. Y.A. Tittle of the Giants threw the same amount in 1963. That record stood for over 20 years before being beaten by Dan Marino in 1984, when Marino threw 48 touchdowns in a single season. So Blanda still holds the record that no one wants to claim, and that is of most interceptions in a season. His record still stands at 42. So Blanda could spend his days relaxing on the beach somewhere, knowing that one day he would make it into the Hall of Fame, going down in history as a legend of the game with the endless list of records that would be very hard to beat. So what does Blanda do? He tells retirement to get fucked, and that's when destiny intervenes once again. Blanda gets a phone call from Al Davis of the Oakland Raiders. Davis is a larger-than-life figure at the Raiders and the NFL. He was the main owner and GM of the Raiders for 39 years, from 1972 right up until his death in 2011. From 1963 to 1965, he was the head coach of the Raiders, taking over as part owner of the team in 1966 to 1971. Davis was a very busy man by the sound of it, and just when you thought he couldn't fit any more on his plate, he was also the commissioner of the AFL during 1966. Davis saw the potential in Blanda and wanted him on the team primarily as a backup quarterback for Darryl LaMonica and kicker. And Al Davis didn't really have to ask anyone to make a big decision like that. After all, he was the part owner and coach, so he really didn't have to answer to anyone, especially if they asked or questioned his decision whether taking on a 40-year-old quarterback was a wise decision or not. So the Raiders were a powerhouse during the 1970s, which was just around the corner. Much of the Raiders' success came from Davis's management and coaching. He was famous for saying, "Just win, baby." The Raiders' success continued right through to the 1980s. The Raiders made the playoffs numerous times over the decades, winning 3 Super Bowls. Al Davis was also inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1992. Al Davis had an internal flame lit in his honour before the start of every Raiders game, and there's that massive eternal flame electronic torch at the newest Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas. Away from the football field, Al Davis was also a great campaigner of civil rights. He also led the way in hiring diversely before it was popular to do so. He hired the first female manager in the NFL, I think. He also hired African American and Latinos in coaching and management positions. So Blanda gets a call from Davis asking him to play for the Raiders. And this is what Blanda had to say, and this is a quote: "One day Al Davis of the Raiders calls me up and tells me I belong to them." End quote. Not a bad gig, even if he was 40 and may not have been as good as he once was. Davis also wanted Blanda to mentor his rookie quarterback, Kenny Stabler, who would be joining the team in the 1968 season. He had asked George to take Stabler under his wing. Stabler and Blanda had a bit in common. Both had been coached by Bear Bryant and had long careers in the NFL. Stabler played for 17 seasons. He was with the Raiders from 1968 to 1979. So Davis sounds like a very smart guy. He has a very clear vision for the Raiders and where their future lies. Hiring Blanda is a very smart move on his part. Even if he isn't the starting quarterback, Blanda's experience may have been what Davis was after, and his skills and his expertise on the field, and by that point he had played longer than most of his teammates had even been alive. Either way, it was a very smart idea that would pay off. Having a guy like that who can coach and mentor younger players on the sideline is invaluable. And obviously, I'm not taking away from George Blanda's skill at all. His skill on the field was just as good and proficient as anyone else in the league, and his stats and what he did for the Raiders during his time with them speaks for itself. He saved the day more than a couple of times. His field goal kicking was second to none, and even at 40 years old, he could prove that he was still a quarterback that could play with the best of them. So it's now 1967, and the Raiders kick off their season with a bang in a 51-0 win over the Broncos. The head coach of the Raiders for the 67 season was John Rauch. He served from 66 to 68. It also saw the legend himself, John Madden, join the team as linebacker coach. It was a bit of a different season for Blanda, obviously. He wasn't the starting quarterback for the Raiders this year. This would be a weird feeling for George. He had been the starting quarterback for Houston for the past 7 years. So this time around, he was on kicking duties and as backup quarterback. So Blanda's first season with the Raiders was pretty much perfect. The Raiders finished the season with 13 wins and 1 loss. What more could you ask for joining a new team? So the Raiders win the first 3 games, losing to the Jets in Week 6, 27-14. From Week 7 onwards, they win every game. It was also the first season to have 17 and not the 15-16 games in a season. There was 15 games in the 65 season and 16 in the 1966 season. So the Raiders make the postseason, playing Blanda's old team, the Oilers, in the 8th AFL Championship game on the 31st of December in Oakland. The Raiders dominate the Oilers, beating them 40-7. So if you were the coach of the Oilers and the ownership of the Oilers, you'd be thinking, was getting rid of Blanda the right move? So while the AFL Championship game was going on, the 35th NFL Championship game was being played on the other side of the country at the same time. The Green Bay Packers were hosting the Dallas Cowboys at Lambeau Field in what would become the infamous Ice Bowl. If you don't know, that was the coldest game ever to be played. The winner of the NFL game would play the winner of the AFL game. I find this interesting, and I might do an episode on this in the future. The AFL and NFL were obviously separate leagues, but they do cross over. The winner of each of the championship games ends up playing the other in what became known as the Super Bowl. So the leagues crossed over. I'm not 100% sure on the history behind the crossover league, but the NFL was the obvious winner in the end. The Packers win the Ice Bowl 21-17 over the Cowboys to play the Raiders in Super Bowl II on the 14th of January. The Ice Bowl goes down as one of the greatest games in NFL history. I think it's number 3 on the list of all-time greatest games. The game was freezing, literally. It was minus 15 Fahrenheit or minus 26 Celsius, with a wind chill factor of about minus 48 Fahrenheit and minus 44 Celsius. That is fucking freezing. That is literally Arctic conditions, and I don't think it would have been fun, no matter how tough you were, to be playing in conditions like that. And this is the era of the open stadium too. There was no roofs or air conditioning back then. The air conditioning was Mother Nature. So the field's heating system had also shit itself, so this is obviously Murphy's Law in effect. So on the coldest day of the year, when you actually need the heating system, it doesn't work. On the coldest game to ever be played, where you really hope the heating system work, it decides to shit itself. Of course it does. It wouldn't do it on a normally cold day or an average day. It has to do it on the coldest game in NFL history. So as a result, when the tarpaulin was pulled off the field, the residual moisture that was left on the field froze during the course of the game, which gave the grass a icy-like surface that got more icier and colder the more the sun moved across the sky and the darker the conditions got. So a bit of a pointless info alert. So as the legend goes, the General Electric heating system, which cost around about $80,000, had apparently been brought by George Halas's nephew on the sideline before the game had started, or something like that. A few of the Cowboys players had come to the conclusion that Vince Lombardi had deliberately taken out the power supply to the heating coils. It's more than likely complete bullshit. It's probably just the Cowboys players being pissed off that they didn't have a reliable heating system or a heater on the sideline or something like that. So this episode became known as Lombardi's Folly. Apparently before the game, hay was placed over the field. There was literally tons of hay or hay bales put on the field to try and stop the ice. So enough about that. The Packers play the Raiders in Super Bowl II on January 14, 1968. Unfortunately for Blanda and the Raiders, they go down to the Packers in a 33-14 game. There was a lot of arrogance between these two leagues. The NFL thought that any of their teams could beat the AFL teams pretty easily. They didn't really see them as a genuine contender or a threat to the NFL caliber of team. On the flip side of that, the AFL were more than willing to challenge the NFL any chance they could get. They wanted to prove to them that they could play with the best their league had to offer. So this is a quote from George Blanda relating to the 1961 season with the Oilers. That first year, the Houston Oilers or Los Angeles Chargers could have beaten the NFL champions in a Super Bowl. I think the AFL was capable of beating the NFL in a Super Bowl game as far back as 1960 or 61. I just regret we didn't get the chance to prove it. Despite the loss, Blanda and the Raiders have a pretty successful year. Blanda's own record was pretty decent, given his limited game time. He throws for 285 yards. He was mainly a kicker during the season, and obviously he was just in the backup quarterback role. He got 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions, so not bad, 3 for 3. He also kicked 30 field goals, completing 20 of them, which is not too bad at all. His quarterback rating was about 39.5% and kicker rating of 66.7. He completes 20, misses 10, that's not a bad statistic. He also earned another spot on the All-Star team, making his 4th appearance in as many years. So it's now 1968. Blanda and the Raiders continued their success during the 68 season, adding Ken Stabler and Art Shell to the roster, ending the season on a very respectable 12-2 record, making them first in the Western Division. The Raiders win the first 5 games, putting up some pretty impressive numbers over the opposition. They beat the Buffalo Bills 48-6, the Dolphins 47-21. The Oilers was a closer game with the 25-24 outcome. They beat the Patriots 41-10. And then the Raiders lose back-to-back games in week 6 and 7, going down to the Chargers 23-14, and then to the Chiefs 24-10, winning every game from week 8 onwards to the end of the regular season in week 15. The 1968 season also saw a growing rivalry with the Jets and their future Hall of Famer and legendary quarterback Joe Namath. There was a lot of bad blood between the two teams. Both were founding teams in the AFL, and due to the way the AFL worked and the number of teams, every team played one another regardless of division or location. The Jets and Raiders rivalry forms over a number of years. There were a lot of events that play into the formation of this rivalry. There was some on-field antics, some behind the scenes, deals and trades that all played into the forming of the rivalry. One of these dodgy trades I'll use to highlight the rivalry between these two comes when Al Davis traded Dan Fike to the Jets during training camp. Al Davis doesn't tell or neglects to inform Jets coach Webb Eubank that he wouldn't be released for another 6 weeks from his military service. So when the Jets played the Raiders, it wasn't a rivalry, it was a war, said Frank Ramos. He was the director of public relations for the New York Jets. There's a good quote that sums up this rivalry pretty well. It's by Randy Rasmussen. He played for the Jets as a guard. Anytime we went into a Raiders game, we knew we were going to come out sore. Guaranteed to get the crap beat out of you. They were a rough, physical team. Dislike isn't the word I'd use to describe how we felt about them. Downright hatred would be more accurate. That accurately sums up the feelings on both teams. There's obviously more to it than just that, but you get the point. The rivalry came to a head in another one of the NFL's greatest games of all time. It was a pretty memorable game, and one that went down in history. So the game is referred to as the Heidi Game. The Heidi Game was played on November 17th, 1968 in Week 11. It got its name from the movie of the same name that was aired on network television and was slotted to start at 7 p.m. What makes the Heidi game so infamous is that when it turned 7 o'clock, the broadcast was cut to viewers on the East Coast, missing the historic final moments of the game. Obviously, due to the different time zones, the West Coast got to see it, but the East Coast didn't. The game ran longer than it should have because of all the penalties and stoppages, and the network decided to cut the feed in favour of the movie Heidi. Instead of playing the end of the game did go longer than it should have, but at the same time it's a live sport, so you really don't know when the end of the game is going to happen. So you can get one of those nights where everything gets wrapped up really quickly, or you can get those games that just drag on and on and on. And this is something that is not new to sport. This has been happening for a long time, so the network probably should have anticipated that a close rivalry game between the Jets and the Raiders would have probably gone a little longer than the slated time slot. The Raiders were getting beaten by the Jets until the final minute of the game, when they scored 2 touchdowns in 9 seconds, winning the game 43-32. The Raiders faced the Chiefs in the divisional game on the 22nd of December, defeating them 41-6. The Raiders move on to the AFL Championship game on the 29th of December, playing the Jets again. It was a close 27-23 game, but unfortunately the Raiders get beaten by the Jets, ending their season on a sour note. During the season, Blanda throws for 522 yards, he gets 6 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, giving him a 61.2% quarterback rating. He also kicks 34 field goals, completing 21 of them, giving him a 61.8% kicking average. His quarterback and kicking ratings are pretty much even. He's putting up pretty much the same numbers in both categories. It's 1969, it's a new year, and time for a new coach. The legend himself, John Madden, takes over head coaching duties. He remains head coach until 1978. Madden's first year was pretty good. The Raiders don't improve over last year's record all that much. The Raiders win their first 3 games, drawing with the Dolphins in week 4, 20-20. The Raiders win the next 3 games, being beaten by the Bengals in week 8, 31-17. They win the rest of the games from week 9-14. Blanda faces off against his old team, the Oilers, in the divisional game on December 21st. The Raiders smash the Oilers, beating them 56-7. So much like the previous season, the Raiders fall short in the AFL Championship game, going down to the Chiefs 17-7. So either way, it's a very impressive season. It's the same record as the previous season, so on the one hand, it's good because they didn't lose any more games than the previous season, but on the other hand, they didn't win any more games than the other season. So they're kind of stuck right where they were a year ago, which is not bad, but ultimately they lose the AFL Championship game, once again ending their season. Due to the success of the Raiders quarterback Darryl LaMonica and his dual back-to-back MVP awards, George saw even more limited playing time as quarterback. Blanda throws for a measly 73 yards. He also gets 2 touchdowns during those 73 yards and 1 interception. He also kicks 37 field goals that season and completes 20 of them, giving him a 54% kicker rating. It's the start of a new decade. It's now the 1970s. It was a season of change and the unexpected. The days of the AFL were over, and after 10 years the AFL was merged into the NFL, or something along those lines. I'm not quite sure how the merge all played out. But after 10 years of the AFL, it was no more. Both leagues fall under the one umbrella of the NFL, and it's all one big league, and one big happy family. In their 11th season, the Raiders joined the NFL. Blanda turned 43 on the 17th of September of that year. During preseason, Blanda was cut from the team. Now, this may have something to do with his age or his playing time. Maybe it wasn't worth having him around if he wasn't going to be playing as much as he had been in the previous couple of seasons. Who knows why they decided to cut him? Maybe they thought he would retire if he was cut from the team. But at the same time, if he was ready to retire, I think he would have done that himself. Blanda being cut from the team didn't last very long. Before he knew it, Blanda was back on the team, making the starting roster. So the football gods were not done with George yet, and as fate would have it, Blanda had a very memorable season. And as things turned out, the old man of the NFL saved the day once again, on more than one occasion. So the Raiders kick off the season to a very rough start, losing to the Bengals in the opening round, 31-21. They draw in week 2, 27-27, to the Chargers, losing again in week 3 to the Dolphins. So the first win of the Raiders season comes in week 4, where the Raiders beat the Broncos 35-23. They win the next few games against the Redskins and the Steelers. The Raiders draw with the Chiefs in week 7, 17-17 again. They always seem to draw with the Chiefs, 17-7 or 17-17. They win the next 3 games against the Browns, Broncos and Chargers before losing to the Lions in week 11, 28-14. This is followed by a 2-game winning streak against the Jets and the Chiefs, losing the last game of the regular season to the 49ers 38-7. They end the season with a 8-4-2 record. The Raiders do well enough to make another playoff appearance. The Raiders play the Dolphins in the AFC divisional game, winning 21-14. They advance to the AFC Championship game, where the Raiders face the Baltimore Colts. And unfortunately for the Raiders, they get beaten by the Colts 27-17. But the highlight of the 1970 season came when Blanda's team needed him the most. What followed becomes the stuff of legend, going down in NFL and sports history as some of the most dramatic comebacks ever seen. So Blanda is 43, it's his 21st season playing football, and there are 5 games that stand out above the rest that showed once again that old reliable, despite his age, could still compete with the best in the league. This became known as the 5-game streak, or just the streak. It all started during week 6 against the Steelers on October 25th in Oakland. The Raiders score first, making it a 7-0 game. Darryl LaMonica gets injured during the game. Now Madden has 2 choices. He can take a chance on his rookie quarterback Ken Stabler, or go with the old veteran. Madden goes with Blanda, and it's decisions like that that make him one of the best coaches to have ever coached in the NFL. A modern day coach might pick a veteran over a star, inexperienced player or a rookie. Most coaches would probably go with the rookie or the young guy because everyone wants to be flashy, everyone wants to throw it 1,000 miles down the field or pull off some spectacular 40-yard run where the quarterback dodges every player that tries to tackle him. So Blanda comes off the bench and steps in as quarterback. At this point, it's a tied game at 7-7. Blanda throws an impressive 44-yard pass to Warren Wells for a touchdown. Blanda also kicks the point after, making it a 14-7 game. He then kicks a 27-yard field goal, making it 17-7. Later in the game, he throws a 19-yard pass to Raymond Chester for another touchdown, kicking the point after, making it 24-7. The Steelers come back. Bradshaw throws to Dennis Hughes for a 12-yard pass and a touchdown, making it a 24-14 game. The game is a 1-score game at this point, and it could go either way. The Steelers could come back for a miraculous win over the Raiders. That is, until Blanda throws a 34-yard pass to Chester, scoring his second touchdown of the game. He also kicks the extra point for a 31-14 victory. Ken Stabler reflected on this victory and had this to say about it, and this is a quote from Stabler on John Madden's decision to play Blanda and not himself. "There was no question. George was the next man up. It was the right move." End quote. In the next game a week later, George saved the day once again. The Raiders faced off against the Chiefs, who had won the previous year's Super Bowl. The Raiders were down by 3 points in the dying seconds of the game. Blanda takes to the field and kicks a heart-stopping 48-yarder with 3 seconds left on the clock. The ball hurtles through space and time, stopping the hearts of every Raiders fan watching. The ball passes through the uprights to tie the game 17-17. Another 17-17 game against the Chiefs. That's creepy. It's very unusual that you play a team like that and you get the same outcome several times in a row. It's always 1-7, 1-7, or 1-7-7, 17-7, or 17-17. Maybe it's being pre-programmed, or it's part of the simulation. So week 8, the Raiders face the Browns in another close game, in the muddy conditions in the Alameda County Coliseum. Blanda scores first, kicking a 43-yard field goal, making it 3-0. LaMonica throws the first touchdown of the game. It's now 10-0. George kicks a 3-pointer, making it 13-0. The Browns come back, scoring a touchdown and the extra point, making it a 13-7 game. The Browns kick another field goal. It's now 13-10. The next 3 scores are all by the Browns. They come back to lead the game 17-10. Cleveland get a field goal, making it a 20-13 game. So the Raiders are down, and Madden comes up with a play. He talks this over with Blanda before making his decision. So Madden is probably thinking at this point, if he knows of anyone that can tie or win this game, it is definitely Blanda. If you're going to get a victory, it's going to be off of Blanda's foot. His field goal stats speak for themselves. He scores more than he misses, so this is a pretty safe bet. If you put Blanda in, you're probably going to win. So Madden and Blanda talk things over, and this is a quote from Blanda, and this is what he tells John Madden before he made the decision. "Let me run 3 patterns to Warren Wells, and I guarantee you will have a touchdown." So Madden replies to this, "If you guarantee it, then do it." So Blanda takes the field with 1:34 on the clock. He throws to Warren, but the pass is incomplete. It's now the second down. Blanda throws again to Warren. Wells makes the catch in the end zone, scoring a touchdown, tying the game 20-20, with not much time remaining. So the feeling in the stadium was one of exuberance and excitement, and this extended all the way to the commentary crew. Commentator Bill King was beside himself with excitement. He was ecstatic when the Raiders come back. He was so ecstatic he had this to say about Blanda's comeback. And this is the quote: "George Blanda has just been elected King of the World." He was obviously pretty excited. As you can imagine, so were all the Raiders fans in attendance and watching at home. So in the dying seconds of the game, Blanda kicks an impossible 52-yard field goal. He makes the kick and wins the game by 3 points in an unbelievable victory over the Browns. So once again, George saves the day. His confidence, his calm and his cool prevail in the most stressful of situations. When times get tough, Blanda steps up. It is now week 9. The Raiders play the Broncos at Mile High Stadium. The Raiders are losing in the fourth quarter of the game. There is 2 minutes 28 seconds on the clock, and Madden decides to take Darryl LaMonica out of the game. He puts Blanda in. George throws for a 20-yard pass to receiver Fred Blittenkoff for a touchdown, ending the game with a 24-19 win over the Broncos. 1 week later, the Raiders play the Chargers in week 10, and just like the previous weeks, this game was a close one, coming down to the final seconds of the game. LaMonica stays in the game, this time with Blanda coming on in the final few seconds of the game to take a 16-yard field goal to win. The final score is 20-17 in a very close victory over the Chargers. And this is a quote by John Madden about the reliability of George Blanda. "It got to the point where when he'd come in, the whole team would go, 'Here comes George. We're going to do it now.' Then pretty soon all the fans started believing, and they'd all go nuts. And then the topper is, when the opponents knew it, he was like, 'Oh no, here he comes.'" So thanks to Blanda, the Raiders go on a 5-game winning streak, with 4 wins and 1 draw. Before Blanda's winning streak, the Raiders had a record of 4 wins, 4 losses and a draw. The streak stops in the next game when the Raiders are beaten by the Lions in Week 11, 28-14. They win the next 2 games, beating the Jets in a very close 14-13 loss. They win the next 2 games, beating the Jets in a very close 14-13 win, and the Chiefs in the week after that, winning 20-6. The final game of the year was in Week 14. The Raiders were massacred by the San Francisco 49ers, 38-7. They got beaten by the 49ers pretty badly last time they played them. They won by about 30 points over the Raiders in that game as well. They finished the season with 8 wins, 4 losses and 2 draws. It's good enough to make the AFL divisional playoffs, and they face the Dolphins once again, beating the Dolphins 21-14. The Raiders would go on to play the Baltimore Colts in the AFL Championship game once again. So Darryl LaMonica gets hurt during the championship game. He does seem to get hurt quite a lot, and he always seems to get hurt when his team needs him, when it's either a close game or a very important game. Maybe it's just the way he played. He probably put his body on the line, and he paid the price for it. So once again, the 43-year-old Blanda steps in, facing off against the Colts and NFL legend Johnny Unitas, trading blows for the rest of the game. Blanda enters the game during the third quarter, throwing a 38-yard pass to Fred Blittenkoff. Blittenkoff gets a touchdown, and George gets a point after. During the fourth quarter, Blanda throws a 15-yard pass to Warren Wells for a touchdown and an extra point. The Colts come back with Unitas throwing a 60-yard pass to Ray Perkins for a touchdown. Despite the Raiders and Blanda's best efforts, it just wasn't enough. The Raiders lose 27-17 during the game. Blanda throws 2 touchdowns, kicked 2 extra points, throws 3 interceptions, has a 48-yard kick, and completes 17 out of 32 passes for a total of 217 yards. So at the time of the championship game, Blanda was the oldest quarterback to play in a championship game. Before that record was broken in 2021 by Tom Brady. Blanda's actions during the 70s earned him the Associated Press Man of the Year award, which also marked the first time a professional footballer had won the award. He also won the Burt Bell Award for that year. And this is a quote by the Kansas City Chiefs owner Lamar Hunt about George Blanda. "Why, this George Blanda is as good as his father, who used to play for Houston," end quote. So yeah, as it turned out, Lamar Hunt's father played for the Houston Oilers. He may have even played on the same team as George Blanda. So this wasn't just people who played with Blanda who were singing his praises. Everybody in the league has respect for him. Everyone has something positive to say about Blanda and his work ethic and how he carries himself on the field. Ken Stabler has this to say about him. During the pair's time, they had gotten to know one another pretty well. They spent a lot of time on the sidelines and going over quarterback plays. "We had a natural bond for a couple of reasons. We both played for Coach Bryant in college, and we were both quarterbacks with the same philosophy about the game. He definitely grabbed me and gave me the advice I needed when I came to the Raiders. George talked to me and he was always there for me. Darryl was the starter, so George and I spent a lot of time on sidelines during games and behind the huddle during practice. He did most of the talking and I did most of the listening. They were good lessons learned." Raiders safety Dave Grayson also commented on George Blanda. This is the quote. "Some quarterbacks you can anticipate. They throw the ball about the same way every time, but not George. You can't read him. One time he'll drill it, the next time he'll loft it a little, then he'll float it." It is now 1971, and Blanda's main role with the Raiders was a kicker. He does back up quarterback duties when needed, but his quarterback time is pretty much all but done by the 1971 season. As for the Raiders, they end the season with the same record as the 1970 season, 8 wins, 4 losses and 2 draws. They lose to the newly named New England Patriots in the opening round. They win the next 5 games in a row before back-to-back ties in weeks 7 and 8. 2 more wins follow that before a 3-game losing streak, beating the Broncos in the last game of the season. The Raiders didn't win the championship game, making it the first time from 1966 to 1977 the Raiders didn't win an AFL-AFC West title. As for Blanda, he throws a very low 378 yards. He gets 4 touchdowns and 4 interceptions with a 58.6% quarterback rating. So he's pretty much on par. 4 TDs and 4 interceptions. It's not that bad considering he obviously is not getting much game time as a quarterback. He also kicks 22 field goals, making 15 of them, so it's not a bad record. 22 out of 15 is not too shabby. So he's doing quite a lot with the little amount of time he is getting to play. So even though he is confined to backup duties, he is still making an impact and getting some pretty decent records. It is now the 1972 season, and Blanda is pretty much just on kicking duties by this point. He throws just 77 yards and gets 1 touchdown. He also kicks 26 field goals and makes 17 of them, so not too bad, with the 65.4% average rating for the season. The Raiders have a pretty decent season, with 10 wins, 3 losses, and 1 draw, making the AFC divisional round once again, losing to the Steelers in a 13-7 game. There was a little bit of controversy during this game, and it would become known as the Immaculate Reception. That would go down as one of NFL's most famous plays. The Raiders and Blanda do play in a lot of games that make the NFL most memorable games list. The Steelers were down with 30 seconds to go. Terry Bradshaw takes the field and throws the ball to John Fuqua. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go on YouTube and look it up because it kind of has to be seen to be believed. It does look like the ball defies physics. Terry Bradshaw throws the ball and it looks like it bounces off of Jack Tatum's helmet or reflected off John Fuqua's hand before spiraling to the ground and being caught by Franco Harris, the fullback, who then runs down the field for a touchdown. There is a lot of debate, even to this day, about if the ball actually hit the ground or not. It also spurred the Steelers and Raiders rivalry. The Raiders seem to have a lot of rivalry games with a lot of teams. It is still a very hotly contested play to this day. Some say the ball hit the ground before being caught, which would obviously mean it was an incomplete pass and not a reflection off of a helmet or hand. And back then, you only had a limited amount of cameras. There was no high definition. There wasn't 58 million camera angles. And there wasn't a bunch of fans in the stands with mobile phones filming and taking photos from every conceivable angle. So all the referees had to go by is what they saw with their own eyes and the replays on old standard analog television. Back then the NFL had a pretty basic camera setup. There was your standard angles, but there wasn't any of the close-up or the ability to get really close like there is today. You couldn't just send the spider cam overhead and get a real close-up of someone's hand or helmet. The Steelers go on to win the game 13-7. They also beat the Raiders in the opening game of the season. So the Raiders have a pretty decent 1973 season. They win 9 games, lose 4, and draw once. Losing the season opener to the Vikings, winning the second game, losing the third before winning 2, then drawing against the Broncos in week 6. Winning the next 2, losing to the Steelers and the Browns in weeks 9 and 10, winning the next 4 to close out the season. The Raiders' record is all pretty similar. It doesn't seem to go up or down that much. It's always 9-4-1 or 10-3-1, 8-4-2. So during the 70s, the Raiders were a very consistent team. You can say what you want about the Raiders, but they always keep going. There's a lot of determination in that team. They just always seem to come up short. There was one big highlight in week 2. The Raiders beat the Dolphins 12-7. Ending their 18-game winning streak that would have continued their perfect season from the previous season of 1972. As luck would have it, the Raiders make the divisional round again, playing their new rivals, the Steelers, beating them 33-14. The Raiders advance to the conference championship and are poetically beaten by the Dolphins of all teams in a very one-sided 27-10 game. Blanda doesn't see any time as quarterback, so it was his first year in a very long time he doesn't put up any numbers on the quarterback front. He kicks 33 field goals, making 23 of them, giving him a 69.7% kicker rating. The 1974 season is more of the same for the Raiders. They win 12 games and lose 2. The 2 games they do lose are the season opener against the Buffalo Bills and the Broncos in week 11. The Raiders go on a 9-game winning streak between weeks 2 and 11, winning the final 3 games of the season. The Raiders make the divisional game once again. The Raiders always seem to have really good regular seasons, but they're always put out in the playoffs. Very rarely do they make it past that second round. They always seem to lose the championship game. The Raiders play the Dolphins in the divisional game in what would become known as the Sea of Hands game. This is another game that makes the NFL greatest games in history list. The 2 rival teams face off against one another, each team being led by a legendary coach. The Raiders obviously are led by John Madden and the Dolphins by Don Shula. The Raiders and Dolphins go back and forth most of the game. The Dolphins kick a 46-yard field goal early in the 4th, making it a 19-14 game, Oakland's way. The Raiders strike back when Stabler throws to Cliff Branch at the 27-yard line. He took a diving catch. He wasn't touched by another player, and he ran the ball back for a 72-yard touchdown, closing the gap 21-19. There's 2 minutes and 8 seconds on the clock. The Dolphins get the ball back and take the lead with a 23-yard touchdown from Benny Malone, putting the ball in for a 26-21 lead. The Raiders get the ball back with 2 minutes left. After a series of plays gaining ground, the Raiders find themselves on the 8-yard line, using their last timeout. Stabler snaps the ball and looks for his favourite receiver, Blinkenkoff, in the end zone. Unfortunately, he is pretty well covered. He looks around again, and throws the ball into a sea of hands. This is pretty much a desperation pass. He throws the ball, hoping it's going to be caught by a Raider and not one of the Dolphins. Clarence Davis fights his way out from 3 defenders to take the catch for a touchdown, taking a late hit in the process. The Dolphins get the ball back with 21 seconds left. It's 28-26. A field goal win the game. The ball is thrown and intercepted by the Raiders, running the clock down. The Raiders win and in the process prevent the Dolphins from going to their 4th straight Super Bowl. Blanda kicks a field goal during the game, adding in the victory. The Raiders play their other rival in the conference championship game against the Steelers. The Raiders lead most of the game right up until the end of the third quarter. It is 10-3. Before a defensive fuck-up in the fourth quarter pretty much cost them the game, with the Steelers scoring 21 points in the fourth quarter, winning 24-13. During the season, Blanda kicked 17 field goals, making 11 of them for a 64.7% kicker rating. He also gets 28 yards and 1 touchdown with a 95.8% rating. And obviously he wasn't playing quarterback much then. He was pretty much just on kicking duties at this point. So this brings us to the 1975 season, the final year that George Blanda would play. Blanda had turned 48 years old on September the 17th, 1975, making him 48 years old at the end of the Raiders season in January of 1976. During his time with the Raiders, they had pretty much given up trying to figure out how old he was, and just listed his age as old as hell. The Raiders have another excellent year under John Madden. They win 11 games and lose 3 for the season. They win the first 3 games before losing back-to-back games in weeks 4 and 5 to the Chiefs and the Bengals, before going on a 7-game winning streak, losing the second to last game of the year to the Chiefs, beating the Broncos in the final game of the season. The Raiders once again make the playoffs. They face the Bengals in the divisional round, beating them in another nail-biter of a game, winning 31-28. The next week, the Raiders face off against their favourites and their all-time rivals, the Steelers. The Steelers get the victory over the Raiders for the second time in a row and the third time in the last 4 seasons. The final score was 16-10. Blanda kicks twice during the game, scoring the point after and a field goal. There are only 3 scores during the game, a touchdown, a field goal and a point after, and Blanda gets 2 out of the 3 scores. During the season, Blanda kicks 21 field goals, making 13 of them for a 61.9% kicker rating. He also has the lowest amount of yards throughout his career, with 11 yards, no touchdowns, and 1 interception for a 5.6% quarterback rating. And obviously he wasn't playing quarterback. Ken Stabler was the starting quarterback, and he had another backup to replace him. So it's pretty much just the kicking stats that count during the season, not like Blanda needed any more records to break. He had nothing else to prove by this time. During the 1970s, between 1971 and 1975, Blanda kicks a total of 79 field goals. He also gets 6 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. During his time with the Raiders, he scores a grand total of 863 points, making it a club high and a record. He is also the first player to score over 500 points for 3 different clubs over the span of his career. In total, Blanda has 277 interceptions, 236 touchdowns, and 1,911 of 4,007 pass attempts, for a grand total of 26,920 yards. He also plays in 4 different decades, making him one of only 2 players in the history of the game to do so. He plays in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. Blanda holds the interception record of 277 interceptions until it was broken by Brett Favre. He also rushes for 344 yards, 9 touchdowns on the ground. He kicked 335 of 641 field goals and gets 943 of 959 extra point attempts. He was pretty accurate when it came to kicking field goals, and it's not hard to see why he was such a desirable choice. And the fact that he has dual roles and he has dual skill sets probably also extended his career. And unlike today's players that pretty much only play one position, there's some that play multiple, but for the most part, most players stick to one role and one role only. This made Blanda pretty much invaluable. He could play quarterback, he could kick, and he could also take to defensive duties when needed. If his quarterback skills faded, he could always rely on his kicking. However, playing dual roles also would have had a pretty big toll on the body. Blanda never really seems to get injured. The separated shoulder he had early on in his career seems to be his only injury he suffers. Granted, he didn't play as much as other players and he wasn't on the field taking the hits that some of them would have been. One of the other records he doesn't seem to get is the amount of time he spent on the field. And the fact that his career spanned 4 decades, his playing time would have been pretty impressive. But whether or not he gets the record for that, I don't know. I couldn't find it anywhere, but maybe not because he does spend a lot of time on the sidelines as well. So this gave him a total of 2,002 total points. There's some additional stats and records. He also gets 2 kickoff returns for 19 yards. He also takes 22 punts for 809 total yards and has 23 fumble recoveries, proving again that Blanda is a multi-skilled player who is pretty much invaluable to any team. One of the records Blanda holds that I don't think will ever be beaten is the most seasons ever played. George Blanda played for a total of 26 seasons in professional football in the AFL and NFL, starting in 1949, ending in 1975. He played from 1949 to 58, then from 1960 to 1975. He also has the most seasons scoring a point of 26. He's one of the 2 players to play in 4 different decades, the other being John Carney, who played in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. He also has the most point after attempts. He made 943 out of 959. He also has the undesirable record of most interceptions thrown in a single season, and that is 42 in 1962. He also held the record for most pass attempts in a single game, being 68 with 37 completions. That was against the Buffalo Bills on January 11, 1964. That was until Drew Bledsoe passed that with 70 in 1994. He also had the most points accounted for, including touchdown passes, in a single career of 3,418. It's not an official stat because I don't think the stats were taken back then. That was broken by Drew Brees and then again by Tom Brady. He also got 114 postseason points, which was an NFL record at the time of his retirement. He's also the oldest player to ever play in an NFL game at 48 years, 109 days. Unlike the record of most seasons played, I don't think that will ever be broken. I think Brady was the closest player that was ever going to come to breaking that record, and now that he's retired, I just don't see any modern day players lasting as long as Blanda or Brady. Blanda got asked a lot about what was his secret to playing so long. Did he have a special diet or workout regime? How did he keep going and performing past the age of 35? How did he play into his 40s and nearly into his 50s? So he answers a few of these questions in an interview he gave with Sports Illustrated. He was asked about age and playing professional sport, and this is the quote. "Personally, I think it's a shame. All the star football players who retired in the prime of their life. Lou Groza, washed up at 43. Ben Argajanian, prematurely retired at 45. Y.A. Tittle, gone when he was 38. And Bob Waterfield at 33. Norm Von Brocklin hung them up at 35, as did Otto Graham, the finest quarterback I've ever seen. Why, that's a tragedy. Does anybody really think that Otto Graham couldn't have played 6 or 8 more seasons? Of course he could. Even now at 49, Otto handles himself better than most of the young bucks right out of college. But like all the others, he fell victim to one of pro football's many unreasoning prejudices. That you're no longer capable of playing when you reach 30 or 35. Baloney." End quote. The end of the 1975 season marks the end of one of the most remarkable careers in the AFL/NFL. He plays his last game during the AFC Championship game against the Steelers on January 18, 1976. George attends training camp the following season, but was released from the team before the start of the 1976 season. George retires at the age of 48. The Raiders would go on to have one of their most successful years, going 13-1, beating the Patriots in the divisional playoff, facing their old rivals yet again in an AFC Championship game, finally beating the Steelers 24-7. The Raiders make it to Super Bowl 11, where they beat the Vikings in a 32-14 victory. Now, unfortunately, Blanda never gets a Super Bowl ring, nor does he ever play in a Super Bowl. Despite all of his records and his remarkable career, a Super Bowl win and a ring are the 2 that George never gets. And unfortunately, some players never make it to a Super Bowl. Even players as great as Blanda sometimes just end up missing out. And unfortunately, no matter how good you are, sometimes it's just how it turns out. So Blanda's retirement also brings with it another lot of records. Most games played at the time. Blanda played 340 games. It's obviously a record that's been broken in recent years. Modern players are playing more games than they did in the 70s, 80s and 90s. There was 14 games in the 1970s. Today I think it's 17, and this year we had 18 games. The top 3 most games ever played as it stands now are Morten Andersen on 382, Adam Vinatieri 365, and Gary Anderson with 353. Blanda retired with the record of the most seasons ever played in American professional football. He played an unbelievable 26 seasons, a record that still stands today. Brady's in a close second with 22 years, 4 shy of Blanda's. So George retires with a laundry list of awards and records that few players in the history of the game have ever come close to topping. In his final year of 1975, Blanda was awarded the NFL's Man of the Year and the AFC Player of the Year. Over the course of his career, he was a 3-time AFL champ, 4-time AFL All-Star, 2-time AFL passing yards leader and passing touchdown leader, and the AFL's MVP. In post-retirement, George Blanda was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame on the 1st of August 1981. In his first year of eligibility, his old college, the University of Kentucky, inducted him into their own Hall of Fame as well. He was also named one of the 100 greatest Chicago Bears players of all time and is in the Houston Oilers/Tennessee Titans Ring of Honor. Blanda is also one of only 20 players to play all 10 years of the AFL before the merge, and one of only 3 players to play in every AFL game for the teams they played for. He holds the record for most games played by a AFL/NFL player who was not just a kicker or a punter. He even had a road named after him. Route 119 is named in his honour in his hometown of Youngswood. The name was changed in 1985 and was changed to George Blanda Boulevard. And this is a little quote from the man himself that I really like. "I never say, this is my biggest thrill. It's what you can do tomorrow that's important." After George left the Raiders, he continued to support them for decades to come. This is a quote from George Blanda in an interview he gave to Sports Illustrated in the 1970s. He was asked about diet and longevity of career, and was he on some type of special diet that may have benefited his career. After last year, people came up to me and said, "George, how do you do it? What's your secret?" Word got out that I had a special diet, that I didn't drink or smoke. One insider said that I was taking hormones, and that was why I was able to play so many games at my ripe old age. Well, there is no secret. My special diet consists of the same things I've been eating ever since I grew up. Steak and potatoes and green vegetables. I smoke and I drink. The worst 5 years of my 21s at the time as a pro were the 5 when I didn't smoke at all. Now I've gone back to cigarettes, a pack or 2 a day, although I don't inhale them. As for alcohol, I enjoy bourbon. It's part of my University of Kentucky background, but I don't guzzle it down like water. I sip it, and I limit myself to 2 or 3 drinks. You may see old George Blanda acting stupid, but you won't see him acting drunk. There's no use changing the routine if it's working, is there? He said. Very good point. You can't argue with that. If you want to compare that with Tom Brady's extreme diet and recovery and exercise program he had, and his TB12 method, the Blanda method definitely spits in the face of that. I mean, Brady doesn't eat bread or tomatoes and a whole bunch of other foods, and George Blanda used to smoke cigarettes on the sidelines during games, which is something you would never ever see a modern day player do. Blanda doesn't seem to care, so maybe there's something to it. Maybe there's something to both ways, the Brady method and the Blanda method. Being ultra healthy can work, but also eating what you always have and smoking and drinking may also work. Blanda's smoking and drinking might have had health effects later on in life, but it seems to work for him at the time. Brady and Blanda at the same age of 43 look completely different, and there's a side-by-side comparison you can look up on that. But it does spit in the face of the modern-day health fanatics and the whole wave of extreme and strange diets. You got some people who don't have any carbs. You got some people who are on the carnivore diet, the paleo diet, keto diet, all these fucking stupid fad diets that really do any of them actually work? I think they probably work on an individual level for some people, but is that more or less a placebo effect or a fact? A lot of people claim a lot of those strange diets do work, and they spend a lot of money doing them. Really, you're just making money for somebody else. At the end of the day, nothing beats cigarettes and alcohol. Fuck the no carbs and kale. Away from the football field, George Blanda was married to his lifelong sweetheart, Betty Harris. George and Betty were married on December 17th, 1949. They had 2 children, George Blanda Jr., he may also be named Rick, I'm not too sure, I found conflicting reports on that, and Leslie Blanda. The pair were married right up until George's death on the 27th of September 2010, 10 days after turning 83 years old. So George spends a decent percentage of his life playing football and on the football field. So Blanda dies of a short illness. It's unknown what it was or what caused it, and that's what's listed on the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He was honoured by his former teams in a moment of silence that was held on the 27th of September 2010 at Soldier Field before the Packers and Bears game. The Raiders held the George Blanda Memorial Weekend during the Raiders vs Chiefs rivalry game. The who's who of the Raiders world were in attendance at the George Blanda Memorial Weekend. Raiders owner Al Davis was in attendance, as was John Madden and past Raiders players. This is a quote from Raiders.com about the George Blanda Memorial Weekend. There's a write-up about the event and who attended, and a couple of quotes from the attendees. And this quote is from Warren Bankston. "I am grateful to God for the camaraderie, fellowship and the great fraternity of the Oakland Raiders. Mr. Davis has never forgotten us. This indeed was a somber yet happy occasion, to not mourn George Blanda's death but to celebrate his life." And this is a quote from the late Raiders owner Al Davis. "He's the greatest competitor the game has ever seen. Some may have been his equal, but none greater. Pride and poise, commitment to excellence go hand in hand with George Blanda. No player has made more of a contribution to the growth of professional football than George Blanda." And that brings us to the end of the show. A big thank you to everyone who listened. I'll be back in about a month with the 4th part of our epic and murky look at the world of bioweapons. There'll be a continuation to part 3 of bioweapons. If you'd like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. You can head on over to the Facebook page, follow and like it. You can subscribe to the Truth Tank on your preferred podcast player. You can rate and review it, leave a review. It helps the show grow. Spread the word about the Truth Tank. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell people you work with, or anyone else you might know who might enjoy it. Thank you to everyone who listened to the end and has supported the show so far. I really appreciate it. Alright, and with that, that is the end. And as always, I'm the Tank. This is the truth. May the truth be with you.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.